There's a sound most people never notice, and once you hear it, you can't unhear it. It's the sound of coins landing softly on a small wooden tray. Not thrown, placed deliberately, almost tenderly, the way you'd set down something fragile. Watch closely, and you'll see a woman, maybe 70 years old, standing at a convenience store counter in a quiet part of Osaka. She isn't rushing. She isn't scrolling anything. She opens a small cloth purse, counts the exact change with her fingers before her eyes even confirm it, and sets it down. A short bow, a quiet arigato. Then she's gone, groceries in hand, mind somewhere else entirely. Nothing dramatic happened, and yet something did. Because that woman will never lie awake wondering where her paycheck went. She will never open a banking app with her stomach tightening. She has never, not once in her adult life, felt that particular kind of dread that so many of us carry quietly, the dread of checking a balance we already suspect is worse than we hope. That's not luck. That's not culture as decoration. That's architecture. Invisible, daily, repeated architecture. And underneath that architecture sits a single, uncomfortable question. One that's going to sit with you for the rest of this story. What if the reason so many people fall into debt has nothing to do with how much they earn and everything to do with what they were never shown? Sit with that for a second. Because if it's true, it means something quietly terrifying and quietly hopeful at the same time. Terrifying because it means income was never really the problem. Hopeful because it means the solution was never about earning more. It was about noticing more. There is a force working against almost everyone reading this right now, without them realizing it. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like an enemy. It feels like ordinary life. Some people call it convenience. I'd call it something closer to autopilot. The quiet, comfortable numbness that lets money slip through your hands without ever really touching your attention. This is a story about 13 small ways one culture learned to fight that numbness. Not with restriction, not with willpower, with rituals so small they barely look like anything at all. The first habit begins at the front door before a single word is spoken. Picture a man arriving home after a long shift. Shoes off, jacket hung, and before anything else, before the phone, before the couch, before dinner, he empties his pockets into a small ceramic box sitting on a shelf by the entrance. Every coin, every day. No exceptions, no negotiating with himself about it. It looks like nothing. A few hundred yen, maybe less, but that box isn't about the coins, it's about the pause. It's a tiny, unavoidable moment where money becomes visible instead of invisible, and invisibility, it turns out, is where almost all financial damage quietly begins. Most people don't overspend because they're reckless. They overspend because money moves through their hands like smoke. A tap here, a notification dismissed there, a subscription nobody quite remembers agreeing to 8 months ago. The coin box interrupts that smoke just long enough every single day for a second of clarity to survive. And a single second of clarity, repeated daily for years, becomes something no budgeting app has ever managed to replicate. That's the first habit, not a system, a rhythm. Now picture something quieter still. A notebook, plain and slightly worn, sitting open on a kitchen table under a single overhead light. Inside it, handwritten columns. Not spreadsheets, not formulas. Just numbers, written by hand, one after another, what came in, what went out, what's left. This is the second habit, something called kakeibo, a household ledger tradition that has quietly passed from mother to daughter for more than 100 years, surviving wars, recessions, and now, strangely, surviving smartphones too. Here's the part almost nobody expects. Writing a number by hand forces the brain to process it differently than typing it does. There's a small delay, a tiny bit of friction. And in that sliver of friction, awareness manages to survive. People who write their spending by hand tend to spend less, not because the pen physically stops them, but because the notebook makes them witnesses to their own choices. Every digital app you've ever used was built to remove that friction, to make spending feel weightless, frictionless, almost like it isn't really happening. The notebook does the opposite. It restores the weight. And once you feel the weight of a purchase again, something shifts quietly inside you. You start asking a question before buying instead of after. That question is the third habit, and it isn't written in any notebook. It's asked silently, almost like a private confession. Every time a hand hovers over something in a store, is this something I actually need or something I want to feel different right now in this exact moment? That single sentence, repeated internally before nearly every purchase, changes behavior more than any spending limit ever could. Because most debt was never built from one enormous mistake. It was built from 1,000 tiny emotional ones. A coffee bought from boredom, not thirst. A subscription kept from guilt, not use. A purchase made at midnight, not from need, but from stress that had nowhere else to go. The question interrupts the pattern before the pattern becomes identity. Now here's where the story quietly turns. Because so far this might sound like discipline, like white-knuckled restriction. It isn't. Underneath everything so far is something almost the opposite of restriction. It's respect. In many of these households, money is treated less like a resource and more like a guest. Something welcomed carefully, something you don't waste carelessly, something you quietly thank when it arrives and thank again when it leaves in exchange for something meaningful. That single reframing changes more than any technique ever could, because money treated as disposable gets spent disposably, and money treated with quiet respect gets spent with quiet intention, almost without effort. This is the invisible antagonist circling beneath every scene in this story so far. Not overspending itself, something underneath it. A kind of numbness, a disconnect between action and awareness. Financial autopilot. The quiet current pulling at almost everyone, everywhere, all the time, whether they notice it or not. And every habit in this story, so far and still to come, is really just a small act of resistance against that current. Which brings us to the fourth habit, one that still survives in kitchen drawers across the country, the envelope system. Cash divided physically, one envelope for food, one for transportation, one for small pleasures. When an envelope runs empty, spending in that category simply stops until the next cycle begins. No app enforces this. No red warning number flashes on a screen. Just an empty envelope, undeniable, sitting there in silence. Digital money has a strange way of lying to us. It always feels like there's a little more somewhere, a little flexibility, a little stretch left in the elastic. Physical limits don't lie, and when a system stops lying to you, you slowly stop lying to yourself. Let's pause here because something important is happening quietly beneath the surface of all these small examples. Each habit removes one tiny excuse. The excuse of not seeing the coins leave. The excuse of not tracking the small purchase. The excuse of not feeling money actually go. The excuse of believing there's a little more available than there really is. One by one, the excuses disappear. And when excuses disappear, discipline stops feeling like effort. It starts feeling like clarity. This is the moment the story quietly shifts into something more uncomfortable because now we have to talk about identity. There's a word you'll hear far more often in Japan than almost anywhere else. Motonei. Loosely, it means, what a waste. But that translation barely scratches the surface. It's not judgment aimed outward at others. It's a personal, almost physical discomfort toward wastefulness itself. Someone raised with that instinct doesn't need willpower to avoid waste. They feel a small automatic discomfort at the idea of throwing away something usable, buying something unnecessary, or letting money vanish without purpose. That discomfort is the fifth habit, and it isn't really a habit at all. It's closer to an inherited reflex. Compare that to an environment where waste is treated as normal, where upgrading and replacing and consuming constantly is worn like identity rather than treated as exception. One environment requires constant self-control just to stay afloat. The other requires almost none because the culture quietly built the control in from the beginning. This is the moment the story quietly reveals its pivot point. Because this was never really about 13 clever tricks for saving money. It was about something underneath all of them, environment shaping behavior far more powerfully than willpower ever could, ever will, ever has. Most people try to fix their finances by fighting themselves. More discipline, more restriction, more white-knuckled willpower squeezed out of an already exhausted mind. But willpower is a limited resource. It gets tired after a long day, after an argument, after grief, after a bad night's sleep. Environment doesn't get tired. A coin box by the door doesn't get tired. A notebook on the table doesn't get tired. An empty envelope in a kitchen drawer doesn't get tired either. These households never really built stronger willpower. They built environments that required less of it. Now, here's a habit that surprises people more than any other because it isn't about spending less at all. It's the sixth habit, and it's about spending on quality, deliberately, even when it costs more upfront. A single pair of shoes resoled twice, worn for a decade, instead of 5 cheaper pairs replaced within 2 years. One well-made kitchen knife instead of a drawer full of dull, forgotten ones. Fewer objects, better objects, longer relationships with the things you own. This isn't minimalism as an aesthetic. It's minimalism as quiet economic strategy, protecting against the slow, almost invisible bleeding of constant replacement. Cheap purchases feel safe in the moment because each one costs so little individually. But stretched across years, they often cost more than fewer, carefully chosen purchases ever would have. The seventh habit hides inside a small, family-owned shop, generations old, tucked into a narrow street where the same lantern has hung above the door since before the owner's grandfather ran the place. He doesn't chase trends. He doesn't expand recklessly. He doesn't take on debt to grow faster than demand actually allows. Growth happens slowly here, deliberately, almost cautiously, the way a tree grows instead of the way a fire spreads. This mirrors something deeply personal, something almost every one of these households seems to instinctively understand without ever saying it aloud. Never build a life financially larger than your actual foundation can support. It sounds obvious once spoken, but look around quietly at how many people live just slightly beyond what their foundation can actually hold. A slightly bigger apartment than needed, a slightly newer car than necessary, a lifestyle chasing a paycheck that hasn't even stabilized yet. These households rarely do this. They wait until the foundation is solid, and only then, carefully, do they build upward. The eighth habit reverses an order most people never even realize they're following. In many of these homes, saving isn't what's left over after spending. It's paid first, immediately, almost like a bill that must be settled before any other bill exists. A fixed percentage, set aside the instant income arrives, untouched, unseen, quietly compounding until one day it's simply there, larger than anyone remembers building it to be. Most people spend first and save whatever happens to survive the month. Reversing that single order turns saving from wishful thinking into something closer to structural certainty. And there's something quieter happening here too, something emotional rather than mathematical. Money set aside early creates a kind of psychological floor, a sense that the future is already, at least partly, protected. And that sense of protection changes how people spend everything else. When the future already feels safe, present spending becomes calmer, less anxious, less impulsive. Anxiety, it turns out, is one of the biggest hidden engines behind impulsive spending. Calm people make calmer decisions with money. These habits, quietly and systematically, manufacture calm. Now for the ninth habit, one you'd probably never notice unless you were looking closely. Silence around money. Not secrecy, silence. A cultural discomfort with flaunting wealth, with visible status symbols, with turning spending into a kind of public performance. Compare that to an environment where spending becomes a form of narration. Vacations photographed and posted, purchases displayed like small trophies, success measured visibly instead of quietly. When spending becomes performance, it becomes competitive, and competition, especially financial competition, quietly inflates spending far beyond what anyone actually needs or even wants. Removing the performance removes the competition, and removing the competition removes an enormous, invisible source of pressure most people never realize they have been carrying on their shoulders for years. We're getting close now to the center of everything, because underneath every single example so far, the coins in a box, the handwritten notebook, the empty envelope, the quality over quantity, the patient growth, the automatic saving, the quiet spending, there's one repeating idea holding all of it together. It's the 10th habit, though calling it a habit almost undersells it. Awareness, not restriction, not deprivation, not gritted teeth willpower. Awareness, repeated daily, until it stops requiring effort and simply becomes identity. The 11th habit lives inside a phrase you'll sometimes hear an older relative say gently to a child, reaching for something unnecessary. Is this really needed or just wanted? Not scolding, not shaming, Just a soft redirection repeated so many times across childhood that it eventually stops being someone else's voice and becomes the child's own inner voice instead. That's how these habits actually get transmitted, not through spreadsheets or seminars, but through small repeated sentences said gently enough to be absorbed rather than resisted. The 12th habit is patience disguised as an ordinary Tuesday. It's the decision to wait one more day before buying something that isn't urgent, just to see if the desire is still there tomorrow morning. Half the time, it isn't. The urge dissolves overnight, revealed for what it always was, a passing feeling mistaken for a moment as a need. And the 13th habit, the quietest of them all, is simply this: treating every financial decision, no matter how small, as something worth noticing rather than something to rush past. Debt rarely begins with one large mistake. It begins with thousands of small, unseen moments, purchases made without noticing, money spent without ever feeling its weight, decisions made on autopilot instead of awareness. And these households, without ever framing it in these words, quietly built entire systems designed to protect awareness itself. Not because they were told to, because awareness was simply how they were raised to see money, the same way some people are raised to see honesty or patience or quiet respect for the people around them. Now think back to that woman at the counter, calmly placing exact change onto a small wooden tray. That gesture was never really about the coins. It was awareness, expressed physically, repeated so many thousands of times across so many years that it no longer required thought at all. It had simply become who she was, and that's what these 13 small habits actually build, not restriction. A quiet, permanent state of noticing. Because once you start noticing your own money the way she noticed hers, something in you changes. And it doesn't change because you suddenly have more. It changes because, for the first time in a long time, you finally see clearly what you already had all along.